Tonight's guest on the Winning Teams podcast is Chris DeSantis. Now, Chris DeSantis is the author of one of my favorite books that I read in quite some time. The title of it is Why I Find You Irritating, Navigating Generational Friction at Work. And it really is a fascinating topic because, probably today in the working world, there are more generations working in the organizations than ever before. And it is really causing a big problem. And he is an expert in this space. He's done his research, he's done his interviews, he's worked with so many clients in globally that he really, truly is an expert in the space. It's an excellent book. And I would highly recommend the book to any manager who aspirations to be a leader, any leader whose aspirations to actually build and have more followers. It is a first-class book to read and to understand the challenge that exists in the workplace today. He is just such an interesting man. I heartily recommend that you sit back and enjoy a very interesting, very learned, and very articulate Chris DeSantis. Chris, thank you so much indeed for being a guest here on the Winning Teams podcast. I am so thrilled to have you here today. It's an honor.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate you having me.
Now, I'm looking forward to it. I've got to say, we're going to dig into your book. I am a huge fan of the book. But before I kind of dig into that, maybe just give people a little bit on your background so they've got context of where you're coming from and your kind of journey to writing the book.
Sure. My background is in organizational behavior. And for the first 10 years of my life, I was inside corporations or organizations in the area of human resource development. That phased out I'd say it petered out simply because I think it was the first to go when there's an economic downturn. I was the canary in the coal mine. Okay. And so after that, I received a nice severance for the last of them. I thought, well, this will give me 6 months to start to have a living, meaning create a living for myself. And so I started to consulting and I found a client. And that was a good client. And so that propelled me on to another client. And so what I do is I do anything related to performance. And my client base typically is in professional services, knowledge workers. You have to find me, and they seem to find me. And so I end up teaching myself topics that are germane to their constituency. And so this being one of them, this actually popped up later on, probably about 18 years ago. I started noticing differences, as we will talk about. And then I started doing homework and basically deconstructing what I'm learning. And so after 60 or 70 of these books, I finally said, what's the white space in this area? What hasn't been covered? And so what I tried to do in my book is say, okay, what is appropriate about this topic to my constituency? And so that's what the book is about. It's about really what is different about us, what is really different, what is perceptually different, and then what do you do about it in the workplace? So that's how it evolved.
All right, okay. Because the title of the book, Why I Find You Irritating, it's a great title. It really grabs you. But it also tells a story, and a very true story, because your byline is navigating generational friction at work. And I just think the book is so timely because I really believe, I don't think we've ever had so many generations in the workforce at the same time, which is causing a huge problem. But also, I think that the way you've written the book, and I said, if anybody who saw the book that I've got here that I've read, I've just things marked, I've highlighted, I've things, scribbles in the line. But I also think it brings clarity to actually quite a complex issue. And I think it is quite a complex issue. But I want to start with some of the caveats that you share about stereotyping and pigeonholing. And just to kind of quote from you is that generational narratives are not destiny. Generational narratives are neither global nor universal. Generational narratives apply primarily to the American middle class. Generational shifts are distinct from stages of life. Can you elaborate on that?
I can elaborate on all of those things, I guess. If we go through this list, the story of who you are determines who you are, meaning your narrative is the consequence of how you were raised. And each of us was raised in whatever capacity we were raised. What we end up doing is we ended up saying, okay, in the case of this, the storyline, let's take that storyline, for instance, and let's distinguish that from the British and the American. As a young person raised in the 60s, I had a distinct experience in the United States as a member of the middle class. And so my experiences we came from a period of abundance. I was a child of what's called the wealth effect, meaning that a lot of the middle class, we had great opportunity. So part of the narrative is shared in the sense that there's commonality of experience among a group of people. But you cannot extrapolate to the England during the 60s, because England was not necessarily, they were just coming out of a rationing period into the beginning of some kind of, I will say, wealth effect, but it happened later. And also the circumstances, what happened in England, were not necessarily mirrored to our own. So the point of this is, I'm a little hesitant to globalize any of this, although when you do get to the millennials globally in the middle classes and above, typically in the upper classes in Southeast Asia and South America, there are some similarities because of the way they are raised. You know, they getting good educations, traveling more, the internet, parental involvement, that creates some consistency of experience in terms of how they interact with the world. So now the stages of life is a distinction. The stage of life is, look, we were all kids. We were all going to be, and we're adults, and then we all grow into middle age. So there used to be 4 stages, and now there's 6 because of the elongation of adolescence and the extension of our lifespans. So that being the case, those are distinct from the storyline of who you are, because when I was 6, and a kid today who is 6 is not having my experiences, they're having their own. Yeah. So one of the confusions on the topic, and I hate to keep going on, but one of the confusions on the topic is when we look at a young person in our workplace, we look at them from the lens of that's just a younger version of me. Yeah. It is not. Yes. It is not. Yeah. It is a younger person in a stage of life that is different than your own. Yes, you had that stage of life, but all the things that sort of culminated to where they are today were different than where they were for you.
Absolutely. But you also talk about it, and I found this really interesting, and it wasn't something that I'd really reflected on before, but you talk about where, and I hope I've got this right, but where events that become the catalyst for change, you know, and you talk about Twin Towers and 9/11, all of that. Yes. But particularly you talk about the impact it had on millennials, because you refer to them as the sheltered generation, and it had a very clearly defined impact upon that generation. Can you just elaborate on that? Because I think it's really interesting to talk about kind of an event, you know, a global event or a national event that can be a catalyst for a shift in that generational piece.
This goes back to basically when this was discussed probably 100 years ago in terms of this notion of technological shifts and the like. Significant societal events shape a generational perspective simply because, and I think the easiest one to get your head around in the United States was the Depression. And the children of the Depression clearly acted differently. Your point about these flashbulb moments, these events, these period effects, they're called, the things that affect us in a way that says, oh, wow, when I was this age, when I was a young child, we landed on the moon. How optimistic can one be as a consequence of that? Yeah. Now imagine a millennial who is 6 or 8 years old, they're watching TV and they're seeing planes sort of hurl into a building. That leaves its mark. So now safety becomes an issue. And by the way, safety has been recurrent as a theme because I think part of that is the parental upbringing about the desire to give to your child that which you did not have. And I think some parents were saying, look, I wasn't attended to when I was growing up. I will not let my child be unattended. And so I think what that does is amplify some of these issues around not only attending and safety in general. And what we end up doing is, I think again, you end up with a child that, to your point, is somewhat sheltered or protected against danger, bubble wrapped.
And that does really influence how they go forward from that event.
I will say this, Gen Z is probably more influenced by that. If you read the work, and I love his work, Jonathan Haidt, and he wrote an interesting book called The Coddling of the American Mind. And he talks to this notion of the triggers and safe rooms in schools and all of that. I think you're going to see more and more of that as we get in terms of as they enter into the workplace. This notion of challenging the First Amendment, saying, well, I don't know if you could say that really triggered me, or that's a mean thing to, so I'm going to report you for that. That's a very interesting phenomenon, but I think it's also an extension or an amplification of feeling safe.
Okay. And I mean, if you talk about that, there is this concern now that I don't want to upset people. I don't want to kind of,
Yes,
people
exactly.
are very easily upset. Do you
Yes.
think is that something that will kind of wash through a generation, or we will come out the other side? Because if we keep going that way, I mean, you'd be kind of careful to say hello to somebody.
No, I agree with your point. I think life is a pendulum. I think what happens is, for instance, I believe the millennial parent now probably felt the attention that they received to some degree was stifling. Don't get me wrong. I think they love their parents, but the overwhelming amount of attention to the decisions you're making relative to who you will become and how I sort of shape you, what colleges you go to, what essays you write, what courses you take, what activities you're engaged in, that all of a sudden I think felt constrictive. And I think what's going to happen, the pendulum will shift the other way, and this Gen Alpha will probably have a greater range of freedom as a consequence of that. So I think there's always a shifting back and forth. I hope this washes, because if we do not make ourselves a little thick-skinned, that does not serve us.
No, it does not serve us well at all.
Yeah.
One of the things that you say, and again, I hope I'm interpreting this the correct way, but that when or where we are born shapes how we interpret information.
Yes.
And when I read that, I was kind of saying, so how do we make sure that we don't get stuck in that place of kind of being stuck in the kind of the when and the where we were born?
You know, that's such an interesting question, because we don't make sure of that. In fact, we do the opposite of that. What we do is we balkanize our relationships. And so what happens is we end up in the echo chamber of people who have the same view of those experiences. So we sit around with other people, that myself, boomers, and we say, when I was their age, when we do a lot of this when I was. And so we think we were right. We think we're objectively right relative to not realizing that maybe there's a different perspective on this entirely. Quite frankly, I think one of the ways to bridge this is we should engage in more mentoring. We should engage in more reverse mentoring as well, because we do not have relationships outside of our balkanized groups unless we're related to them. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we have to be intentional in saying, I don't get why you're doing that, but I want to know why. I want to understand it. You see, versus I don't like that you're doing that. Why aren't you doing what I want you to do? You follow? Those are two different things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I know I'm jumping around the place because I'm kind of touching different parts of the book, because I want to give people a sense of what it is. But I want to talk about hybrid working, not about whether it's going to, what way it's going to be or anything like that, but really kind of interested in when you were talking about the different impact it had on the different generations. Because we tend to kind of see it as a one size fits all. It was all this, it was all that, and now it needs to be all the other. But actually, for the different generations, it was actually very different for them, wasn't it?
Well, I think if you think about this hybrid workplace, first of all, it's a vindication of the young. They have always said that, look, I could use greater flexibility. I can do this from anywhere. And we have always said, no, you can't. And so in that sense, I also think one of the mistakes we make is we overlay who is giving us the message of wanting greater flexibility or a hybrid workplace against the messenger themselves. You see, we judge that. And so, and in my defense, let me make a defense of the boomers and the hybrid, the desire to get them back in the office. Boomers' relationships are a consequence of the work that they did with others in the office. So the office was sort of the foundational part of their lives, and how I build relationships, how I have my network, how I am successful. So the idea of them wanting people to come to the office is saying, I'm doing this for you, but it's heard from you're doing this to me. And I think we're misidentifying what the conversation should actually be about. Is at what stage do you have mastery and to what you're doing, and do you have a network necessary in which to do it well? And that's when we should give more flexibility. You see, if you have no mastery, you should be around other people who have it, so you can learn to do it quicker. And so in that sense, there's credence to being in the office, but to say it's a locational issue is absent of why is there a location. This is what's frustrating to the young. It's because they're being told what to do, and the young want to engage in a dialogue of why are we doing it?
And it's frustrating for them.
Oh, absolutely.
Just when you're talking to boomers, of which I would fall into that category myself, but I also thought it was very interesting what you were saying, that, that boomers engage with their own children in a very different way that they engage with people of the same age as their children in the workplace. And it was only when you said it and I was reflecting upon it, I thought, that's actually really true. But
absolutely.
So that ends up being very confusing for everyone.
Oh,
right? Really, both sides, both ways, right?
Everyone's confused.
How do you resolve that, or how do you fix that, or how do you square that circle, whatever you want to put
Well,
it?
you first of all, you raise the curtain on this. You educate them around this, because what happens in the home is a dialogue model. That's the home front. Basically, your parents are highly. By the way, I would suspect you as well, John. We are not children of dialogue with our parents.
No.
We are the subject of being told what to do. That's a tell-do model. And so that's what we lived with. By the way, and then when we came into the workplace, it was no different. It was no different.
Yeah.
That we were congruent. The bad news is a child raised today is raised in the home in a dialogue. They understand why it's going on. Let's talk about it. Let's negotiate. Yet when they come into the office, they're living under the auspices of a tell-do model, because that's the only model, the hierarchical model, that the people that they're working for understand in the office. And so they compartmentalize who am I at home from who I am in the office. My advice has always been, what you're doing in the home is highly effective. Why don't you employ some of that in the office and imagine you cared about them in the same way?
But it's the conditioning, isn't it? It's the conditioning
Yes,
that
it's
we
a
were brought up
conditioning
that we were
Yes.
brought up with. I mean,
Oh,
I've often
absolutely.
kind of smiled, and kind of to myself, and I've said it to other people as well, that, when I started working, if I came home to my parents and said, you know what, I'm just not engaged in the work, so I've left, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I'm pretty sure I know the answer, and I wouldn't be able to repeat it here in a podcast, right?
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
it just would not have been tolerated in any shape
No,
or form.
not at all.
And when I went to work, I was glad to have a job, because that was the
Yes.
way, right?
Yes.
I appreciated it. I did what I was told, and that was the way you did it. So I mean, now it's evolved for the good. I mean, absolutely. I would hate to think that we'd be back in that place, but it does show the different way of thinking that we need to adopt, and not to, as you say, apply what we have. The other one that I thought, again, when we talk about it, I use the term work-life balance. I don't actually like that term, to be
No, it's
perfectly
no
honest
such
with
thing.
you, because it kind of has a connotation, because there is just life, and it's about finding space for doing
Yes.
different things. But I love the piece from your book is saying to a Gen Zer at a job interview that you offer flexible working arrangements is like saying to them that they'll get to work in a building with door. Gosh, no kidding, real doors, right? And so when you're actually going through that interview process, and of course, there is right now, as you well know, this great war for talent, right?
Yes.
What are the things that we need to be offering that generation? That doesn't sound, well, of course you're going to give me that. You're going to give me flexible hours. What do
Yes.
we need to be promising them in order to attract them into our organization?
Well, first of all, you need to shorten the length of your promise, meaning where do you see, don't ask this question of where you see yourself in 10 years. I think it's just because first of all, it's the real answer is, I don't know, but no boomer wants to hear that.
Yeah.
Every boomer would have had a rehearsed answer, down the hall from you, John, down the hall from you. So that's what we would have hoped for, you see?
Yeah.
So we're looking for an aspirational answer as opposed to an honest one. I think what we should be asking the young is, what would you like to be learning over the next year or two if you take this job? You see, that gives me more information as to where their interests lie, and does it align with what we have on offer? The other thing I think we should be doing, because of this side hustle is so prevalent, is not to ask a young person if they have one, but rather what it is. And then say, what skills are you bringing to the table with regard to that you want to develop? Now I have another hook, because what I'm looking for is you see, to your point earlier, John, we have moved from an economy or a worldview that was, I call it in the book, the covenant, a promise of employment for life. And if you did what you're supposed to do, and you basically did what your boss asked you to do, you're pretty much guaranteed a job and some movement up and retirement. Now these young people live in what's a transactional world, where I'll give you something, but I expect something in return. This is why we're so aghast when they ask us for, well, what's your vacation time? When can I start? Do I have to come in every day? And this is an interview, and we're thinking, wow, I'm giving you the privilege of the possibility of working for me, and you're asking for stuff already. And so we are shocked by that, but they're saying, whoa, a transaction's a transaction. You get from me, I get from you. So what is it? So in that sense, I think this is the change has happened. Is it for the good? Sometimes.
I think it is. I mean, I do think overall, I think it is good, because
I do.
because I think the interview has got to be two ways. Right?
Yes.
It's not a one way. And of course, historically, it was just a one way process, and very much kind of in that way. But I think that the book has just got so much good stuff in it.
Oh,
But if I was to ask you before we wrap up, just if you were to ask you, what advice would you give to a leader who is leading a multi-generational team? What are the piece of advice that you would want to anyone listening here right now? They're leading a
yes.
multi-generational team. What can they walk away with and say, aha, Chris tells me this is what I need to focus on?
Yeah, as a leader, first of all, don't assume you're a leader. You are a manager first, who, and if that manager is competent, then I might choose to follow you if you have
Yes.
characteristics in which I find worthy of following. So don't be my first piece of advice is remove the hubris from the equation. So now imagine though they wish to follow you, and I think the people who want to follow you will follow you if you remove also ambiguity. That means I think you should have expectation meetings when you start with people. You should tell people why you like what you're doing. And you should tell them, my gift to you is make you better at X, whatever that X is. And then this is the process by which I would do it. What are obstacles in your way to achieving that? What do you need from me to do that? Now what we're doing is we are setting the ground rules between us, and we're setting up the negotiation for how we will act with each other. You do not have to acquiesce and say, oh, I want freedom all day long, or I want you to be available to me all day. No. That's not available to you. What is available, I'll do this. So my point is, there's an expectation of negotiation, and there's a removal or reduction in ambiguity. That, I think, is a more honest relationship. I think, so that's the key.
I love that. I really do love that. And Chris, as I said to you, I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's not only is it a great read, but it's also a great book for somebody to have as a manual to kind of go through and say, here are different situations, and I should look at that. Before we wrap up, and I can get you tell people where they can get in touch with you and get the book. 2 questions I ask everybody. One is a book other than your own, and that's had an impact upon you. What's the book and what was the impact?
Well, that was such a hard question you asked me. I felt I'm a very hopeful person, and so I thought Steven Pinker's work of Enlightenment Now was a very helpful book in terms of, look, the world is better than we imagine, because we imagine the world is localized to just the experiences that we're having with the news that we see. And he's saying, no, the world is better on all measures, and this is why. And he shows the data. I like hope with facts. I thought that was a very moving book, and his other books are equally moving. So I would endorse Steven Pinker. All of them are good.
Yeah,
How the Mind Works was great. Rationality.
Yeah, super author. Second question: daily rituals. Do you have them? Are you happy to share them? And what do they do for you?
I travel a lot for work, so I try to exercise in some capacity, in some small way every day, because the habit of travel allows you to be a little lazy.
Well, it's very difficult to keep. I mean, I know because I travel a lot.
Yeah, you would know.
It's difficult to keep that up when you're traveling, isn't it?
Right, because I mean, there are so many distractions. Oh, well, I'll order in a room service, or I'll wake up a little later because I got to go. You know what I'm saying? Oh, I walk through the airport a lot, so I guess that's enough. No. So my ritual is to find space every day to do something.
Great, Chris. Where can people get in touch with you? How can they connect with you? Where can they buy the book?
Yes, you can get the book on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or you can go to the website of the publisher, Mascot Books. You can get in touch with me through cpdesantis.com. That is my website, and that will give you access to sort of my background in general. My email is chris@cpdesantis.com if you have any questions. And I didn't mention this, but I have a podcast with a friend of mine, Mary Abijay. It's called Cubicle Confidential. And we answer any questions that people give us. We usually take 3 strange questions a week. And so in that sense, you could always write us at Cubicle Confidential.
Fantastic. Chris, it has been a joy and an honor. I've been looking forward to this since I've read the book. Thank you so much for being with us. It has been just fantastic.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate it. You're a wonderful host. I appreciate this.
Thank you.